Hi again, everyone. This is Jeff Weiss, co-chair of Steptoe's International Trade Policy Practice and lead of the firm's supply chain team. Welcome to Supply Chain University, where we dive into the legal policy and advocacy issues involving supply chains. And it's all supply chains these days. To find out more, visit our website at steptoe.com. On this episode, we're back talking with Gene Soroka, the executive director of the Port of Los Angeles, in part two of our interview about all things supply chain and goods movement. Gene, again, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jeff. Good to see you again.
So in the first part, we talked a little bit about what's happening at the port congestion, some of the ideas being batted around about FMC reform. Want to pivot and talk a little bit about what you see coming up in the next few years and some solutions to these issues of congestion and supply chain resiliency. And just to start, I'm wondering, what types of supply chain disruptions do you foresee occurring in the next few years, and do you think the U.S. and other countries are ready for them?
Short answer is no. But what we see are a more capable opportunity in the area of digitization, protected by strong cyber, shifts in sourcing patterns as folks try to get their legs under them for more resilient supply chains. But it's also important to understand the difference between procurement, sourcing, transportation, supply chain, et cetera. Not one easy lever to pull on all of these to be able to protect the goods flow, whether it be finished or products, components, parts, and peripherals for manufacturing. We've got to find a way as a country to improve our export capability, whether it be in our farmlands, our manufacturing facilities, or in the automotive sector. We're starting to see some great technology with electric vehicles coming out at the passenger level, and some very strong statements from General Motors, Ford, and others in that area. Those are going to be products that needed to be exported as well. So we've got to figure out a way to give ourselves a better balance. The trade policies of the last administration will have lingering and ongoing effect, and not for the good. Through those policies, Jeff, we've seen imports increase, exports decrease, and the trade gap widened, which is putting immense pressure on the asset owners and service providers to find those round-trip economics when we've been in such a headwind of policy and a surge of imports based on the pandemic buying patterns that we've witnessed over the last year.
Yeah, and it's going to be tough to unwind those tariffs. It looks like the administration is making a pretty big effort with Europe. Announcement just earlier this week about Boeing Airbus. I know they're still working on steel and aluminum, but it's pretty. I know from my experience at USTR, it's really tough to unwind some of these things. There was also a suggestion that they're going to consider another Section 232 investigation in the recent supply chain report. So I don't think they've put that tool permanently back in the tool bags. So I think we could see more action in that area. And I do want to come back to talk about exports. As we've discussed before, the normal percentage of empty containers going back to Asia, I think, is normally 50%, and it's been up to, I think, 70%, 75% recently. And clearly, like politically, that's going to be an issue. And as you said, we need to talk about that. And let's talk about your national export idea a little bit later on. But I also want to flag, obviously, there's a massive infrastructure bill being discussed in Washington right now. And depending on what day you ask, what hour you ask, the prospects for that bill can kind of go up and down. Assuming that goes forward, what should be included in that bill for ports and related infrastructure to facilitate goods movement?
Well, there's a lot to like about the American Jobs Plan, Jeff, and with more than $600 billion outlined by the president for transportation, it's a great start. And I think it was $17 billion for ports and waterways. I'd like to see that edge up a little bit. And the competition around where the value can be driven from that investment, all roads lead to Los Angeles. With cargo that moves to each and every congressional district in the nation, we can have the greatest impact in the goods movement and supply chain sectors with even more investment. Our own David Libatique worked for over a decade with ports around the country and the United States Congress to reform the Harbor Maintenance Trust and tax system. We now have donor equity for big ports like LA. We've kept smaller ports and energy ports in line. They haven't lost a nickel. We've expanded the use of this work, and we've also created opportunities for a consistent and full spend of those tax dollars that are brought in by our customers. That's a great position to begin that conversation of infrastructure. Also within the American Jobs Plan are some really nice opportunities with electric vehicles, nationwide broadband, including for rural America, and resiliency of our grid. All of those with small carve-outs for ports can really see us take action on some of the most important issues facing us, like supply chain resiliency, as well as our sustainability and goals to be a zero emissions port by the year 2035.
And I know, we have the infrastructure bill. We also have the China bill, and the House is now considering what to do with the Senate version. There could also be additional legislation depending on the outcome of the administration's supply chain review. So, as we mentioned earlier, there's been the beginnings of a top-to-bottom supply chain review in the U.S. under Executive Order 14017, America's Supply Chains. And as you know, I worked on supply chains for Secretary Pritzker, and at that time we were dealing with these issues as they came up. We didn't have a proactive strategy, so it's great that the administration is doing that. And part of the review is going to include the U.S. transportation industrial base, the importance of transportation systems in supporting supply chains across the board, and there are many of them mentioned in the report, and also the risks associated with those transportation systems. So I'm wondering, what advice you would give the administration as it undertakes that review.
Well, they've already met the high water mark on the first, and that is developing these task force around the supply chain. I think it's agriculture, transportation, and commerce, all set out after the 100-day review to bring people together and talk about what's necessary. That is step number one, and we used that with Secretary Pritzker to get our digitization program off the ground 6 years ago that you were such an instrumental part of, Jeff. And so talking about where these supply chains are today, again, the difference between procurement, sourcing, how we're going to move cargo, whether it makes sense to onshore or nearshore parts. Still, to this day, about 20% of all of our imports at the nation's largest seaport are components, parts, and peripheral for the American manufacturing system. How we can better connect 1/3 of all of our exports in the agriculture sector to overseas markets is also going to be a big part of this. And still, with 8 or 9 million Americans out of work, getting them into the export sector, according to the Department of Labor, has wages that pay on average better than other sectors. So this could have a multiplier effect of upside for our economy nationwide.
Yeah, I definitely think it could be transformative. As we were discussing earlier, the potential funding for the Commerce Department to create the Supply Chain Resiliency Center, that's potentially game-changing. Having USTR chairing a task force on supply chain, getting them in the game more, I think is really important. I was also heartened to see the emphasis in the report on the need to work with other countries on building resilient supply chains, recognizing that not everything can be built here. As you know, there are a lot of inputs that are needed to manufacture products here for export, and so you have to really take a fact-based approach and look at, like every port is different, every supply chain is different. I was also heartened to see mention of the need to look at regulations and permitting to ensure supply chain resiliency and make sure that's a factor, along with other objectives of regulation like environmental justice and equity. We mentioned tariffs before. One thing I think is going to have implications is China policy. That was clear. All the sections of the report mentioned China, and I can't help but think that in the coming months we're going to see, based on the report, more regulations that make it more difficult in U.S.-China trade. I think the question is going to be, is it going to be focused Is it going to be risk-based, or is it going to be all-encompassing? And obviously, if the broader it is, the more disruption it could cause. One thing that I thought was really interesting as well was they talked about sustainability and the importance of environmental protection and labor rights and reducing GHG emissions. And I think all those things, there's a moment where there's a bit of a convergence between good environmental policy and good labor policy being part of a really strong competitiveness policy as well. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. And clearly that's an area where I think California can lead. And so I think it's going to be, extremely interesting to see how that might be translated into policy.
Yeah, and make no mistake, Jeff, we're behind in these areas. Through political undertones, we walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership and its European equivalent during the election in 2016, and we were left away from the table with the monumental advance of the RCEP, which has just about every trading nation now involved, with the exception of the United States. So forging those alliances on a multilateral level is better than trying to get into a fight with the schoolyard bully one at a time. We need to build coalitions, and I think we're seeing that with the president's visit and the G7 summit, the NATO meeting, and now today, of course, when we're taping this podcast, is when the president is meeting with the Russian leader, Putin. And we've got to keep building these alliances and finding out better ways to put blocks of trade agreements today that are, as friend and mentor, former USTR and Secretary of Commerce Mickey Cantor continues to say, rules-based trade agreements. And they can have all of this wrapped in, as you rightly say. We've got to look at protections for our workers. We've got to look at environmental sustainability and business rules that allow countries who trade to both flourish.
Yeah, and I think trade agreements are going to look a lot different going forward. I know that the administration is looking to take a different approach, a worker-based approach. And you mentioned G7, that international infrastructure effort. It's going to be interesting to see what that could look like. It'll be interesting to see if the U.S. reaches out to the Quad, to Australia, India, Japan in particular, on infrastructure. I know they're talking about supply chain resiliency. So there could be a lot of different ways of doing this. And I'm wondering, you're on the Commerce Secretary's Advisory Committee on Supply Chain Competitiveness, which I worked on for many years when I was at Commerce. And, how have the interactions been with Secretary Raimondo thus far? And, what is the committee working on? Is it looking at these types of issues?
It's like the old days when you were at the agency, Jeff. We now have access again to the great talent, both appointed and career. The secretary joined us for one of our recent quarterly meetings and stayed for almost an hour, giving her thoughts and views on where we need to go and taking in suggestions and ideas such as the national export strategy that we're promoting here in Los Angeles. So it was just such a breath of fresh air, and I think she's going to add tremendous value to this country and our administration.
And speaking of which, as you mentioned the national export policy, wondering if you talk a bit about the causes of the import-export imbalance and what the components of that policy might be to address the imbalance.
Yeah, there have been a number of things that have happened. You can't put your finger on any one area, but to name a few, the trade policies of the past administration have absolutely knocked the American exporter out. Now, I am not advocating that we simply just drop tariffs and allow others to take advantage of us. Rules-based trade agreements are key. Second, the monetary policy. With the strength of the U.S. dollar, it helps us in so many ways as the world's currency, but it hurts our exporters because our goods are more expensive than our competing nations. And a great example of that is how Brazil has just beat us to the punch time and again in the soybean and agricultural market, and we can't keep pace. The Phase 1 trade deal that was touted so greatly by the past administration has prices at non-compensatory levels for the American farmer. They can't harvest, ship, and collect revenue on that product and even think about breaking even. That's got to be looked at one more time again. And how do we make the American exporter attractive once more to the service providers. Instead of shipping a bunch of empties back on the container side of our business, how can we square this circle of bringing containers into metro areas, shipping them out full from rural locations? How do we triangulate those economics is going to be one of the questions that we'll bring answers to here shortly with the recommendations that we're bringing to the Secretary of Commerce.
Yeah, I think it's going to be key not just to look at the federal level, but look at the state and local level as well, and think about new trade tools and some of those things could be to improve efficiency. Some of the port-to-port work that you've done on promoting both efficiency but also environmental sustainability. That to me seems like a model for making sure it's both a public and private sector strategy.
That's right. And 4 of the 5 containers we import today, Jeff, here in Los Angeles, go back empty. Los Angeles County still boasts the largest employment base of manufacturing anywhere in the country, with more than 390,000 people in manufacturing jobs here. Yet, only 1% of those companies export. So how can we tie transportation, manufacturing, that great knowledge base that we have here, and imagine a truck going to a location to bring a container and pick one up at the same place instead of making multiple runs? Right there, we reduce air emissions just by the sheer simplicity of round-trip economics. So there's much to do, but there really is opportunity for us ahead.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, Gene. I always love our conversations on these issues. And, given the intense focus on supply chain policy in Washington, D.C. these days and your efforts, I think there's a real possibility of substantial policy changes being made, and really appreciate your thought leadership. And, thanks again for coming on the show, and looking forward to continuing our discussion on all of these developments.
Great to see you, Jeff, and so proud of the work you're doing with the practice at Steptoe. Thank you.
Thanks again, Gene. And that's it for this edition of Supply Chain University. You can find this in all of our videos at steptoe.com. You can also find us on YouTube, where you can like and subscribe. Thanks everyone for joining us. See you soon.